Today's event is about the United Nations. In the popular imagination, the United Nations is primarily thought of as a kind of large, creaky bureaucracy that's very inefficient and that fails in a lot of what it does. What we're trying to do today is to tell people a little bit more about what the UN does, what it can't do, what it can do, what it's good at, and what it's not good at. So we'll be hearing from a series of experts on peacekeeping, the Security Council, human rights, and disaster relief. And together with that, we have an exhibition of photographs showing the work of the UN that relates to our research. So I'm going to start with just a very, very brief history of the UN, for those who aren't familiar with how the organization got set up, and then we'll hear from the rest of us on areas that are related to our particular research. Okay, so most of you probably know that the UN was founded in 1945 in the aftermath of World War II. Discussions had actually been underway for quite a while between the Allied powers about putting together an organization that could prevent that kind of war from ever taking place again, and ensuring that human rights were assured, freedom for all was assured. So it had kind of fairly big idealistic goals when it was founded. The UN Charter was signed by 51 member states originally, and it officially came into existence on the 24th of October 1945, and that is still known today as UN Day, and it's usually marked by ceremonies and things like this at UN headquarters. The Charter states that the main purposes of the organization are to maintain international peace and security, to develop friendly relations among nations, to achieve international cooperation and promote respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms for all, and to be a center for harmonizing state actions to achieve those other purposes. Now, it started with 51 member states, but as you can see from this little animated slide, it has grown massively since it was founded to 193 member states, and there were particular spikes in 1960 with decolonization in Africa, and then again in 1990 with the breakup of the Soviet Union. And the newest member state is South Sudan, which joined in 2011. Unfortunately, this graphic ends in 2008, so you don't get the chance to see it carved out as a new state there in the center of Africa. The organization has 6 main organs, which you can see here. The General Assembly, the Security Council, the Economic and Social Council, the Trusteeship Council, which is now basically defunct, the International Court of Justice, and the UN Secretariat, which is run by Secretary General, currently Antonio Guterres. The structure of the UN is highly reflective of the sort of international geopolitical situation at the end of World War II. The Security Council is the UN's main decision-making body, and in theory, at least, its decisions are binding on other members of the UN. It's made up of 15 members. 5 of those are permanent members, so-called P5. They are China, France, Russia, the UK, and the US. Those 5 countries have veto power, so any decision that is tabled to the Security Council, they can veto. This means, of course, that they can effectively block anything that they don't like. But at the same time, the fact that there's 5 of them was intended to mean that no single one of them could pursue a very narrow interest. So it's a little bit unclear where exactly the decision-making power lies. The other 10 seats are filled on a rotating basis. Members are elected for 2-year terms by the General Assembly, and we're going to hear more about that from Professor Zam in a little while, and why they may or may not actually want to be on the Security Council. By contrast, the General Assembly, every member of the United Nations is a member of the General Assembly, and there is 1 vote per country. The only difference there is that the decisions of the General Assembly are in general non-binding, so its power is significantly less than that of the Security Council. And because of that dynamic between the Security Council and the General Assembly, the geopolitics of and the geopolitics between the P5 members have a heavy influence on what the UN does and does not do. And I would actually really like to stress this point because I'm going to raise it again later. When we say the UN, we do need to be a little bit careful about what we mean. You'll see that both in terms of the structure, which I'm going to show you in just a second, but also in terms of what we mean between the UN and its member states. It is member states, ultimately, who are making decisions and telling the Secretariat what to actually go out and implement. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the Secretariat has no power to do anything on its own. So it is always a little bit of a question whether the UN is just the sum of its member states or whether it is something a little bit more than That's the UN system. So if you thought you understood the UN, you probably didn't. I certainly don't, and I've been studying the UN for a long time. I used to work for the UN. You can see here those 6 main bodies along the side. But in addition to the growth of its membership, the UN has also grown to encompass an array of associated funds and agencies, which are informally referred to as the UN system or the UN family. These include bodies that you'll be quite familiar with, like the UNHCR, which is the Refugee Agency, or the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the UN Development Program, or UNICEF, which works on children's issues. But as you can see, it is a hugely complex organization, and of course there is a large bureaucracy behind all this to make it run. And I think it's from that that the UN gets its sometimes poor reputation. Most people do tend to think of the UN as a large, unwieldy bureaucracy that is very efficient, that struggles to make things happen, that's associated with a lot of failures. John Bolton there, who was the former US representative to the UN, was famous for his disdain of the organization. Lord Mark Malloch Brown, who was a former Undersecretary General, or Deputy Secretary General, even he, who is ostensibly a fan of the UN, has referred to it as a large, labyrinthine, underfunded bureaucracy. So is that a fair assessment of the UN? Well, that's what we're hopefully going to find out a little bit more about today. So I will turn it over now to Professor Zaum, who's going to tell us a bit more about the Security Council, and then we'll hear about peacekeeping, human rights, and disaster relief.
Thanks, Sarah. So as we talk about the Security Council, I'm interested in the Security Council because it touches on it is central to the kind of core mission of the UN. And if you look at the UN Charter and read the preamble, it says this in much more evocative words than is sort of summarized here. Apologies. It has the first sentence, the purpose of the United Nations is to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war that twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind. It is an incredibly evocative, emotive language, not the kind of language we normally associate with a kind of bureaucratic document. So the Charter is a beautiful document, and I think it's worth reading. So that's my pitch for the Charter. But it also, you can see how it links really closely to the mission of the Security Council, which is the key body of the international security architecture, for, I think, 2 reasons in particular. The first is legally, because it is the only body that can authorize the use of force other than in self-defense. Every state still has the right to use force in self-defense, collectively or individually, and it has the ability to pass legally binding decisions that are legally binding for all states, even though they are not members of the Security Council. Whether they're influenced or not is a different question, but it has the authority, not necessarily the power, but the authority to take these legally binding decisions. So it's a legislative body as well as an executive body. But arguably even more importantly, politically, it's at the heart of the international security architecture, because it is, to my knowledge, the only institution that on an almost daily basis brings the most powerful states and 10 other states, which includes some quite powerful states, together in a diplomatic forum. The Council meets almost every day. There's no other body in the world, no other international organization where states come together on such a regular basis. And it's a hugely important channel for communication, for agreement and disagreement, but for these reasons it is kind of the heart of the kind of concert of great powers, which I think is an important element of what the UN is, and that helps, I think, to explain its continued relevance despite all the criticisms. As Sarah has highlighted, the UN, but also in particular the Security Council, has faced a lot of criticisms and challenges. And the criticism of the Security Council, with its 15 members, 5 permanent members, they have focused on 2 issues in particular. The first is the lack of representativeness. The 5 permanent members reflect the post-1945 order. They are the victorious allies plus France, and that is clearly not necessarily a reflection of the kind of existing world order and of the and other important regional powers and important emerging powers such as India, Japan, Brazil are not represented permanently on the Council. And the criticisms of states such as Brazil have focused in particular that Brazil, which has now refused, we'll see how long that refusal lasts, but in 2018 said they will no longer seek non-permanent membership on the council until this archaic body changes its structure and processes, so that it and states like it will be better represented. But it also is criticized for its lack of effectiveness. In debates around Syria, where because of the Russian and Chinese veto, but also with regard to the Palestinian conflict because of the US veto, or because just none of the five powers really wants to address a particular conflict, as with regard to Rwanda in 1994. For a whole range of reasons, the Council is seen as lacking effectiveness in fulfilling this mission of saving succeeding generations from the scourge of war. And the criticisms very often come from those who are instrumental in preventing the Council from taking decisions. The US has been a fervent critic of the UN failure over Syria. To what extent it's its own failure, rather than your failure is a separate question. But this is a kind of second strand of criticisms of the UN. In many ways, both of these focus on the role of non-permanent members. On the one end, their representation or lack thereof, and their ability to engage in the work of the council, but also many of the remedies to addressing both the effectiveness and the legitimacy of the council and representation on the council seem to focus on increasing the number of members. So for me, the question of, well, actually, what influence do the non-permanent members have I think is a really interesting question to answer, and it's one, and that's the one given. I prepared two possible issues to discuss. I'm going to focus on this one just because of time, and so we have more time for discussion. I can come to the other one. Why do states want to become non-permanent members afterwards if you still have time? But so I think the question of what the influence of non-permanent members is a really interesting one, and I think there are two different strands of thought. The first one is what I call the anecdotalists. These are those who draw on anecdotal evidence that a particular country at a particular moment in time managed to shape council policy. An example would be Brazil with regard to what is called the responsibility to protect, which is the responsibility to protect civilians in particular through, if necessary, through the use of force against actions of their own government. So Libya is a very prominent example of this, and of course the Security Council in 2011 authorized the use of force by NATO in that particular case to use force against the Gaddafi regime to protect civilians. And Brazil pushed this line of responsibility while protecting. So while you engage in this use of force, you need to behave in certain ways. And it tried to shift the debate, which it did quite successfully in the context of the UN. I think there are other examples, such as Australia and its influence on procedural reform in the Security Council, which is quite an archaic, not even science, but a debate normally only of interest to the true aficionados of the UN. But I think what more importantly this anecdotalist approach completely fails to appreciate is that countries are influential not because they're a non-permanent member, but because they're just influential. Brazil is an important regional power. And Brazil's influence on the responsibility to protect happened when it wasn't on the council largely, as well as when it was on the council. So the fact that it was a non-permanent member was completely incidental to its influence on the particular process, I would argue. And that is the challenge for all of you who are budding social scientists, that you can't just generalize from a single case. So there's a wider methodological point to be made here as well. The second school of thought about the influence of non-permanent members is what I would call the structuralists. These are those who make a structural argument about the lack of influence of non-permanent members. So they kind of turn it around. They say, nah, they can't be influential for a range of structural reasons. There's the veto. Yeah? So the permanent members have the veto, and therefore they will dominate proceedings. There's the power of permanency, being continuously involved in the debates in the council. Many of the issues on the council agenda go back 10, 15 years or longer. Some go back right to the start of the foundation. They're on the agenda since 1948 or even before. So, having been involved and having the institutional knowledge clearly gives you a strong advantage as a permanent member. It's difficult to shift this when you're just brought onto the council and you roll off again in 2 years. By the time you've learned the ropes, it's time for you to leave again. And of course, the denizens of King Charles Street, the Foreign Office, very often refer to them in quiet moments as the tourists rather than as and that to some extent reflects the disdain that some of the permanent members might have for them. But this seems to be overly deterministic, because we have these examples of where they can actually shift it, and it's a very static picture. It doesn't actually involve and look at the kind of day-to-day activities and how states on the council interact. Now, there's a very good reason for this, and this is that the council is incredibly opaque. It's really difficult for academics for us to observe the way the council works, because debates are either very formalistic, and they're pre-prepared statements that are read out, and at the end there is a vote, and either almost everybody agrees in the voting, the vast majority of votes are unanimously, or debate shifts behind closed doors, or into fora outside the UN in smaller groups. So it would be the so-called P3, the US, Britain and France, who very regularly have previous consultations and tend to, as critics say, stitch up a resolution in advance, or into other closed-door fora where there's no record kept. We don't know how individual states shifted the language of the resolution or the ultimate decision. So how can we then systematically look at the influence of non-permanent members on decision-making of the UN? And I think that there are two questions we need to ask. And the first is, how can their influence manifest itself? What is it that they can influence? And then the question we need to ask academics, well, how can we measure it? Yeah? So we don't just claim it, and because someone told us that this is the way, how can we credibly measure it? So let me just briefly touch on these two questions. How can influence manifest itself? I would argue you can do that in three different ways. States can shape the agenda. They can help to shape what is discussed in the council. That itself is hugely important, because it elevates the importance of a particular issue onto the international agenda. It is very interesting to see what states try to keep off the agenda. Yeah? Northern Ireland never managed to get onto the Security Council agenda, because Britain fought very hard to ensure it never got there. Yeah? But then and there are some things states would love to get off the agenda. India has been trying for a long time to get the Kashmir conflict off the agenda. And ever since Kashmir was on the agenda, it's fought very hard to get everything else that involves itself off the agenda. Because it makes life just a lot more difficult when you're on the Security Council agenda and so forth. So can states manage to shift things on there? Can they put thematic issues on that they're interested in? So for example, climate change, or women, peace and security, or other issues, or a particular conflict, can they shift it onto the agenda? The second way of influencing is shaping the content of Security Council decisions. Decisions of the Council are taken through resolutions. So how can states shape the content of resolutions? Can we somehow trace that? And thirdly, can states shape the implementation of decisions? Some of the decisions of the Council are implemented by the Council itself, through its subcommittees, through sanctions committees and others. So how do states lead on the implementation? Can we look at that? I want to focus on one of those, which is shaping the content of Security Council decisions. So the question then is, how can we measure that? When decision making is opaque, we don't have regular access to draft resolutions. We don't know who changed the text from one draft to the other. We might know in some cases because states talk about it, but there is no way that it's systematically captured. And as I said, the negotiations happen outside the public eye. So one way we can look at it is sponsorship of resolutions. Every resolution needs a sponsor. A resolution can have one sponsor or 15 sponsors. But only when you're a sponsor can you formally amend the text. There are other ways in which you can do it, but if you sponsor a resolution, you're more likely to be able to change the text, but you also invest political capital into the content of the resolution. You might align yourself with other states who are supporting it, you show your opposition to the views of other states. Sponsorship can have real consequences. Just to give you an example, when New Zealand sponsored a resolution in 2016 on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, on the issue of settlements, which was ultimately vetoed by the US, Israel called in the ambassadors of all the sponsoring states, which was quite an uncomfortable position to be in. It is not, if you sponsor a resolution, if you're a council generally, you might be required to take positions you're quite uncomfortable taking, but because of the internal dynamics, you need to do so. So sponsorship is at least one way in which you can start to systematically look at this, because sponsors are recorded. Now, it indicates that the state is either actively involved in shaping the content, or indicates it supports another state's position. Now, before looking at sponsorship, let's just take a quick step back and think, well, who are we looking at when we look at the non-permanent members? Potentially we're looking at, well now, 188 states who could be members. There were fewer in the past, but now potentially 188 states. And we often distinguish between the permanent members and the non-permanent members when we want to look at the dynamics in the Council. But actually the non-permanent members are, as isn't surprising given the size of their group, a hugely heterogeneous group. They're heterogeneous regionally, economically, politically, in every possible kind of way, however you want to cut the cake. It's a hugely diverse group of states. But one important distinction we can make, which is not a formal one, but one I think we can make, is those states that are regularly on the Council as elected members, and those that have been there maybe once, or even never at all, because there's a number that have never been on the Council so far. Some, like South Sudan, have only joined the UN a few years ago, but others who have been members for a long time haven't been on the Council. Indeed, if we look at the last 50 years, there's a group of 10 to 12 states which occupied 30% of the slots on the Council each year. So in each year, out of a total group of 180 states, up to 180 states, a group of these 10 to 12 states, on average 3 of them were on the Council. So states like Japan, Germany, Brazil, India, Pakistan, Colombia, Italy, and a few others have been at the South Africa, Nigeria, have been sort of at the heart of the non-permanent membership. They're almost semi-permanent members because they're so often there. You know, they're repeat offenders, one could call them. Yeah. But that makes these states particularly interesting to look at, because if they're there regularly, we would expect them to have more influence. Both because they get the support from other states to be on the Council and manage to mobilize that support to get onto the Council, and then we'd expect them to be able to also influence the permanent members more. They're largely significant regional powers, so you expect them to have more influence. And of course they have overcome the problem of non-permanency to some extent. They're so often, they should have a degree of institutional memory, even if they don't have the detail. So we would also therefore expect them to be the most actively involved of the non-permanent members and to have the greatest influence. So what do we find when we look at sponsorship? And that's just one possible indicator. The first thing is that the frequency of being on the Council is not a good predictor for your influence on resolutions, in terms of if you measure it through sponsorship. Being an aspiring member to be a permanent member, such as Germany, Japan, Nigeria, South Africa, isn't necessarily a good predictor either. Some states like Brazil or Nigeria, South Africa rarely co-sponsor resolutions, in contrast to some much smaller states who are very, very active in that regard whenever they're on the Council. What we do find is some correlation between state capacity and engagement and co-sponsorship. So states that have a higher GDP per capita and are therefore able to sustain a larger diplomatic service, and we often use GDP per capita as a proxy for state capacity, tend to be much more engaged and co-sponsor for more resolutions. It's a much better predictor. Actually, almost the same, we find almost the same correlation when we look at the size of missions. So countries with a relatively large mission, with a couple of outliers such as Luxembourg, tend to be quite actively involved, but those with smaller ones are not that involved. So capacity, again, seems to be a reasonably good predictor. Now, what does this suggest, and why is that actually an interesting thing to explore further and to think about and to maybe discuss further? The first one is that state capacity, rather than your regional role and your prestige, seems to shape your ability to influence the Council. The second one is that sponsorship without a permanent member of a resolution is increasingly rare. It's incredibly rare. Very few resolutions are sponsored just by non-permanent members. So most of them are followers rather than leaders. So the mechanism seems to be more throwing your weight behind one of the permanent members rather than trying to actively shape the content of the resolution. And why I think it's politically important is if we think about Security Council reform, which normally involves some form of enlargement, the states that would be on the Council more regularly as a result of this might not necessarily be the ones that make it more effective or that actually shape the outcomes. So the outcomes that we see now in terms of alleged lack of effectiveness might not be very different with the different membership, given those states that we would expect to join on the basis of all the wider discussions, Japan, Germany, India, Brazil is the kind of leading contenders, South Africa, Nigeria for a permanent seat, are not necessarily the ones that are actively driving Security Council decision-making as far as we can see. We have spoken for far too long, so I'll stop here now and we can pick it up from there.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take over again myself. So actually some of what Dominic just said actually feeds in or references nicely to what I'm going to talk about, which is peacekeeping. So peacekeeping is, I suppose in many ways known as kind of the flagship UN activity. You'll have seen from the images outside this room, often what we think about when we think of the UN are troops in blue helmets deployed to conflicts around the world. What's interesting about that, going back to the charter, which I agree is a beautiful document, I probably should have given it more credit when I introduced it. Peacekeeping isn't actually mentioned in the charter. The charter authorizes the UN to take, quote, appropriate measures when there's a threat to international peace and security, but it doesn't specify what those are. So peacekeeping was born almost as an accident, and it happened in 1948 in the aftermath of fighting between the new state of Israel and Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. A ceasefire was negotiated, and the UN deployed a small number of troops to monitor that ceasefire. And that's how peacekeeping came into being. And that mission, which is called the UN Truce Supervision Organization, is actually still in existence today with the same mandate. Now, since then, peacekeeping has expanded dramatically. There have been 71 missions since 1948, and there are currently 14 that are ongoing. Missions are authorized and mandated by the Security Council, and altogether they employ over 100,000 military and civilian personnel. The current annual budget is just shy of $6.7 billion US, and the biggest contributions to that budget come from the United States, China, Japan, Germany, and France, with the UK coming in sixth at 5.7% of that budget. Military personnel are also contributed by member states, and the current biggest contributors are Ethiopia, Rwanda, Bangladesh, India, Nepal, and Pakistan, and then a number of other countries with smaller numbers. The earliest peacekeeping operations, like UNSO, are what we usually refer to as traditional peacekeeping, and that's essentially exactly what I described for that conflict. A peace has been negotiated, there's some kind of ceasefire agreement, or a dividing line between two warring states, and troops are deployed along that line to keep those warring states apart and to monitor the ceasefire and prevent any violent incidents. These early peacekeeping operations operated according to three sort of key principles. Consent, so that the warring states had to consent to there being a deployment between them. Impartiality, so the UN troops were not allowed to take sides in the conflict. And the non-use of force except in self-defense. So they weren't there to fight the war. They weren't there to, subdue these parties into not fighting. They were there to simply keep them apart, and they could only respond if they were fired upon. Now, since then, we've moved very much away from that model of traditional peacekeeping to what's commonly referred to as multi-dimensional peacekeeping. Wars nowadays are primarily civil wars. They take place inside states. So UN troops, if they want to do peacekeeping, have to deploy within states. Now the context within which they deploy has also changed dramatically. They're increasingly deployed to places where there isn't a peace to keep. Peace has not yet been made. So they have to make the peace before they can keep the peace. And they also face a variety of new security threats. So things like terrorism, irregular warfare, and so on. Those kinds of things didn't really exist when this activity was just getting started. So as a result, there's also been an increase in the use of force by UN peacekeeping missions. There's also been an enormous expansion in the mandates of missions. Some of the conflicts to which the UN has deployed have proven remarkably resistant to resolution. And so over time, the UN has come to realize that if it really wants to bring peace to these countries, it can't just go in and sort of try to keep people away from each other. It really has to address the root causes of the conflict. Why did violence break out in the first place? Otherwise, the minute they leave, there's a high chance that war will break out again. So UN peace operations now play much more of a political role, and they attempt to bring conflict parties together. They attempt to build political institutions, they strengthen the judiciary, they train civil society, they reform the security forces, including the police. And they assist in humanitarian recovery. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. We now have missions that are also taking part in HIV/AIDS awareness, in gender affairs, in public information and media, and most recently in the protection of artifacts in some countries where wars is leading to the destruction of historic sites and objects. So that mandate expansion continues. And I just want to, we can debate the merits of that expansion, but one thing that I do want to point out is that part of that expansion of mandates has been a push to democratize or at least liberalize post-conflict states. Here the thinking is that if countries have democratic institutions and a fairly elected government, then they will start to resolve societal disputes through dialogue and institutions as opposed to resorting to violence. And that's a very deeply ingrained belief in the UN. Whether or not it's true, whether that actually is how it works in reality, is a different question, but certainly that's a belief that's quite deeply ingrained and not always questioned within the UN. So as a result, most mandates for peacekeeping operations do include some reference to democratization or at least liberalizing post-conflict states. So with that background in mind, I'm just going to do sort of a brief tour through some of the successes and failures of UN peacekeeping. Does peacekeeping work? Is this kind of accidental institution of the UN an efficient and useful one? And I'm going to start with failures. There's no shortage of failures to talk about. There are, of course, first of all, the very high-profile ones that Dominic mentioned, like Rwanda in 1994, where there was a peacekeeping operation present. Most of it withdrew shortly before the genocide, leaving only a handful of troops behind who were pretty much powerless to do anything. There is Srebrenica in Bosnia, where again the UN failed to prevent large-scale atrocities against civilians. There were Dutch troops present who were ostensibly guarding a safe area, and nevertheless they stood by while over 8,000, primarily men and boys, were massacred in 1995. How do failures like that happen? Well, in these instances, we can see again that dynamic that I mentioned before, where member states can constrain the UN. I'm not saying that the UN itself wasn't obviously to blame here, and there is, of course, an individual failure of judgment by those troops on the ground at that moment, but we do often end up in situations where the UN might want to act, but it's not authorized to act by the Security Council, and it's not given the resources with which to act. So, for example, in Rwanda, Belgium withdrew its troops from the peacekeeping operation there because 10 of them were killed by the people who would go on to perpetrate the genocide. Now, of course, that's exactly what they wanted. They were trying to get these troops to leave so that they could go about doing what they wanted to do. And it enabled them to act with much greater impunity than had there been a larger UN presence there. And at the same time, key member states in the Rwanda case were wavering in the Security Council. The US, for example, there's a very famous video of somebody from the US State Department talking about acts of genocide rather than genocide, because had they said genocide, it would have forced them to do something. So again, key member states who had the decision-making power and the power to authorize a stronger mission weren't acting, and so the UN wasn't able to go ahead and do anything. Of course, the failure there to act led to the deaths of 800,000 people, and the geopolitical repercussions of that are still being felt very much throughout all of the Great Lakes region of Central Africa today. A very current example of this is the conflict in Syria. Despite the introduction of numerous resolutions condemning the violence there since 2011, most of them have failed to pass because key member states in the Security Council, primarily China and Russia, have vetoed them. There have been 12 resolutions like this that have been vetoed. So in this way, while I think most of us tend to think the UN failed, we do need to be very careful of whether it was a failure of the UN or of the member states that direct the UN with what it can and cannot do. Some failures, of course, are very much the fault of UN personnel themselves, and the most egregious example of this relates to the misconduct of UN peacekeeping troops around the world. There have been widespread cases of sexual exploitation and abuse, including of children. There have also been allegations of corruption and illegal trafficking in mineral and other goods. And in 2010, very high-profile recent case is that UN peacekeeping troops were responsible for a large-scale cholera outbreak in Haiti that killed thousands. In that instance, the Secretary General actually did issue a public apology, which is fairly unprecedented for a Secretary General to do, But since then, the UN has sort of wavered on any kind of compensation or sort of concrete action. There have been some attempts, but in general, the UN is trying to shrug off any legal responsibility for that outbreak. And then finally, peacekeeping brings with it a raft of unintended consequences. And there are a lot of these that I could talk about, but I'm going to talk about one in particular because I've done some research on it. And this is about the risk of propping up authoritarian regimes through peacekeeping. Now this is quite puzzling because, as I mentioned before, peacekeeping usually tries to introduce some kind of democratic institutions and to make countries more open and transparent and liberal. However, that's not the only thing they're mandated to do. They're also mandated to bring stability and security to countries. They have to maintain good relations with the regime so that they can retain consent to even being present. And so, unfortunately, those types of things sometimes conflict with the sort of more liberal goals of a peacekeeping operation. While a fully developed and fully functioning democracy might be a very stable thing, transitions to democracy, particularly after war, tend to be very rocky and risky. Power holders who had a lot of power because of or before the war face the possibility of losing their positions, and those who benefited from war economies, for example, will probably look quite suspiciously at attempts to introduce more transparency into the political system. So if the UN puts too much pressure on incumbents to democratize, it's very possible that they'll say, you know what, thanks a lot, but you guys can leave now. And so oftentimes we see the UN backing down on those attempts to democratize, and this unfortunately emboldens kind of would-be autocrats. That's sort of more on the political side. On the military side, again, in an attempt to introduce stability and security into the country, the UN is usually mandated to strengthen and support the state security forces. But of course, doing that gives them additional coercive capabilities that they can use to put down their opponents or other challengers to the regime. So again, the intention is good. The intention is to strengthen the state, but in doing so, they're giving the state capabilities that it can use for other objectives and enable incumbents to tighten their grip on power. These outcomes are, of course, inadvertent. I'm not at all arguing that the UN goes out there and tries to promote authoritarianism, but it is sort of the unhappy side effect of the fact that UN mandates, as I described, are very, very complex. They're very multifaceted, and they have a lot of stuff in them, and some of that stuff simply contradicts itself. Now, I don't want to be all doom and gloom. I'd also like to talk about some of the successes and benefits of UN peacekeeping. First of all, there has been research done to show that countries that have peacekeeping operations generally do tend to have a lower rate of return to conflict than countries that don't. And indeed, there are a number of success stories we can tell about countries that, they're still on a path to full stability, and they're not perfect by any means, but they have seen a remarkable turnaround. So places like Liberia and Sierra Leone, which have seen the missions there withdraw and go home, and those countries are now on their own. I mean, there are follow-on support mechanisms in place, but by and large, those countries have remained stable. Timor-Leste became independent, largely under UN auspices, and the mission there has also withdrawn. And a number of countries in Central America also had missions in the early 90s that have since closed down. Again, none of these countries is perfect. They don't turn into the famous sayings, they don't turn into Switzerland overnight, but they have remained by and large stable. Second of all, UN peacekeepers go to the hardest places. They often go to conflicts that other countries wouldn't go to because they're just not considered geostrategically important enough. And I think that's a really important function of UN peacekeeping. The UN shines a light on wars and conflicts around the world that we wouldn't otherwise really pay attention to. And in this way, it does help to bring awareness, and it does help to set the agenda. So through advocacy and through exposure, it can help pressure states to take action or to contribute in some way to trying to resolve those conflicts and to prevent more suffering and humanitarian catastrophes. And then finally, UN peacekeeping is very cost effective. The total budget for UN peacekeeping is less than 0.5% of total global military spending. That's really embarrassing. That's actually my phone. So I'm just going to turn that off. Sorry. that means that the UN has to make do with low numbers of troops, old equipment, its transport systems are weak, it gets hand-me-down planes from member states that don't want them anymore, not to mention the difficult terrain and conditions in the countries where it deploys, and also the fact that it's all taking place against the backdrop of political wrangling in New York about how much money should go where and what it should be spent on doing and so on. All of that said, it is a pretty cost-effective mechanism for resolving conflicts around the world. So while, yes, UN peacekeeping is imperfect and it's had a lot of failures, I think one could make the case that with the resources that it has at its disposal, it's doing a pretty decent job. But again, that's something that we can certainly debate in the Q&A. Okay, Rosa. Rosa's going to talk to us about it.
Thank you very much. Well, it all sounds really complicated, and I want to go back a little bit to basics. The UN, as has been said, was created in 1945 in the aftermath of the Second World War, and there were 3 pillars that it was created on. And from the sounds of what's happened already so far on this panel, and from the sounds of what happens mostly at the United Nations and outside the UN, most people think that the UN is simply about peace and security. Let's make sure that there's never again another world war or threats to international peace and security. And of course, that's a huge purpose, but it's only one of the 3 purposes of the United Nations. And the other 2 purposes are human rights and development. And Marie will talk more to the development aspect, but I want to look a little bit at the UN and human rights. Now, human rights is really the second-class citizen at the United Nations. When we saw the slide that Sarah showed us about the different organs, we have the General Assembly, we have the Security Council, we have the International Court of Justice, we have ECOSOC, but we don't have a particular human rights body that's a main organ. And from day one, there wasn't a human rights main organ, and even 12 years ago when there was big reforms to the UN and human rights, there didn't become, or there wasn't created a main organ. First of all, human rights was a subsidiary part of ECOSOC, of Economic and Social Council, and now it's a subsidiary part of the General Assembly, which tells you a little bit maybe about how the world views human rights and its importance. I'd like to give you a very brief history on this. I don't think I need to tell you about all of the many human rights challenges that the world faces, whether it's migration and the migrant crisis, whether it's around political dissidents being imprisoned around the world, camps, labour camps in North Korea. Wherever you look in the world, from Sweden to Somalia, there are human rights abuses going on. And in many ways, these human rights abuses have changed somewhat with globalisation, but they all have their roots not only in the last 70 years, but really throughout civilization. Where you've got human beings, where they have power and authority and control, some of those human beings will take them out on others. The central tenet of the modern part of human rights, the last 70 years since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by the General Assembly, is that you have a weak individual. We're all weak individuals. And you have the big, powerful state. And in order to provide some kind of redress between that weakness and that power, states have to be bound by certain laws that they have to do for the citizens in their own territory. Right? The way that international law generally works is that I'll buy your bananas for 20p and you're buying my oranges for 30p, and if I stop buying your bananas at 20p, you can stop buying my oranges at 30p. Right? And we might all have these arrangements throughout the room, but if I break an arrangement with one of you, you can break the arrangement back. The way that human rights works is that a country says, I pledge not to do something, or I pledge to do something, I pledge not to torture people, or I pledge that I will ensure that everyone has adequate housing in my territory. And it doesn't matter if you as a country break your promises in your territory, I can't then say, well, you've tortured a few people, so I'm now going to torture a few people. Because it's not an arrangement between states, it's a promise, a unilateral promise to a kind of central arena of this is how I will behave in my own country. And the reason that that happened in 1948 is Nazi Germany. Not the Second World War, but what happened within Nazi Germany. Because at that time, it was not unlawful for a country to discriminate, torture, murder, or do anything else to their own citizens. And this had been going on for centuries. Don't think that Nazi Germany was the first place to have concentration camps or to have mass discrimination. But it was the first time it happened in Europe. And that made, and this is my own analysis, right? I'm not basing this on any theoretical analysis, But it's quite stark that the way that European nations have been behaving around the world for centuries in terms of colonialism and imperialism, once it was happening on European borders, suddenly made the world wake up and say, it shouldn't be okay for you to treat people under your own control in any way that you want, when you have to treat civilians in wartime from other countries in a certain way. And we need to have a regime and a system to make sure that no state can ever treat its own citizens like that again with impunity, or at least we have to make it unlawful for them to do so. Which all sounds great and idealistic and wonderful, and we have the 1948 Declaration, which wasn't a binding document, it was just recognising, you know, these are the human rights that the world believes in. At that time the world meant the colonial powers in a few states that weren't under colonial rule. It wasn't representing the 193 countries that we now have today at the UN. And in this great idealism, it was felt that we shouldn't talk about vulnerable groups like women or people with disabilities or racial minorities, because we all have fundamental rights by virtue of being born human, and they should all be the same as one another. Very quickly, it became clear that there were sort of two sides to human rights. There was the USSR, which believed in economic and social rights, the right to food, to adequate housing, to healthcare, to joining a trade union. And then you had the sort of US and Western European countries which believed in human rights as a freedom from interference, the right not to be tortured, the right to freedom of assembly, to political participation. And it became really clear with that kind of Cold War divide that there was no way of turning this Universal Declaration into one treaty that all states would sign up to, so it became very quickly two treaties. One on economic and social rights, which countries like Russia signed up to, one on civil and political rights, which countries like the UK signed up to, and then you have the countries like the United States that just don't sign up to any treaties because they believe everyone should be bound apart from themselves. Over the course of the Cold War, there was more and more treaties were created and developed. Quickly it was recognised that we might say that women have equal rights to all human beings, i.e. men, but most countries weren't allowing political participation of women or education of women or, you know, women to choose who they married and so on. So there became a special treaty about women, and then soon after one about children, one about people with disabilities. There are lots and lots of vulnerable group treaties. They still continue today. We're currently negotiating, I say we, the UN's currently negotiating on treaties on the rights of older persons, rights of peasants, because we recognise specific vulnerabilities that come with particular characteristics. But it wasn't really until the 1990s and the end of the Cold War that the UN started doing things beyond creating laws and creating understanding of what those laws mean. And that was because that was the end of the Cold War, and there was this, again, another great idealistic moment in the early 1990s of we might all come together as members of this United Nations who really believe in the fundamentals of human rights and actually start protecting and promoting rights on the ground. That was the beginning of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, who's the figurehead for the UN Human Rights from the Secretariat. We saw a greater development of mechanisms for protecting and promoting rights. And we also saw a big pushback from countries that don't particularly like human rights. Countries that they might not be anti-human rights themselves as a good or a force, but they don't like this idea that they are bound by law to behave in a certain way in their own territory. They want state sovereignty. They want to be able to do what they want in their own country without external interference. I'm racing through this, but if you want to read any of my books, you get a slightly more measured one. Happy to give you free copies, I'm not plugging them here. We had a big reform agenda at the UN 12 years ago, where again there was this big push. What could we do to foreground human rights? There were proposals that the human rights body ought to be a main organ. There were proposals that it ought to have powers like the Security Council and some teeth to act. For various reasons this didn't happen. Mostly it's called politics and diplomacy. Countries don't want to give up the ability to send their diplomats to these bodies, right? But if you're not sending experts on human rights, you don't really want those diplomats who have all of their own agendas, often not related to human rights, to be able to take action against other states. And I sound doom and gloom, Sarah, and I always sound doom and gloom, but I'm not actually doom and gloom about this. The reason not is the UN's human rights body is, I would say, the most effective part of the whole UN system. It's universal. That doesn't mean that it can get into every country, but it can try. It shares information and it does fact-finding around the world, which feeds into the Security Council, into the General Assembly, into the Secretariat, is normally an early warning system for grave atrocities. Many a genocide and crimes against humanities and war crimes have been prevented through that early warning system. That doesn't mean that they're stopped altogether, but they certainly are not allowed to build up to the types of atrocities we saw in Rwanda or in Yugoslavia, during our lifetimes. It's probably the only place where states come together and have a genuine discussion about their own culture, understanding, awareness, agenda, politics, politicization of a subject area. And it's a very transparent system. The different UN human rights mechanisms tend to be webcast. Civil society can go and attend. You can all go and get a public pass to go and sit in the Human Rights Council for the day if you fancy a day out in Geneva. All of the documents, including documents, from behind the scenes, not all of them from behind the scenes, but many are available in all 6 languages of the UN, as this is materially different to what happens at the Security Council. And the decision-making process is not just about states, it's also about the independent experts that staff treaty bodies or that are special rapporteurs. It's also about civil society being able to feed in at every step of the way, academics being invited in, people sitting on panels there who are from the outside. And the main reason I would say, that I always argue, that this system works, is that everyone wants their issue to become a human rights issue. Right? People who are working on the environment say, well, we don't want our own separate system because actually this isn't working. We want to try and bring the environment into human rights. We want to try and make this a human rights matter. People working on finance say, well, we should bring extreme poverty into the human rights system. People working on peace and security. There's a whole group of states that would like to have a human right to peace. They want to bring it into the human rights arena. And the reason for that, there's always the bad guys that want to do that to dilute the system, but the real reason for that is that this system works. It doesn't work perfectly. There are lots of things about it that could be reformed. There are lots of discussions on reform that actually result in reforms occurring on the ground rather than remaining at abstract level. But by and large, this is probably the best part of the system. And I will end with this. Despite being the most effective part of the system, I argue, it receives 3% of the UN's annual budget. Now, the UN receives, as we heard, over $6 billion, nearly $6 billion for peacekeeping. It has a biannual budget of $5 billion, right, plus voluntary contributions, right? States can say we are going to fund this particular body or not fund this particular body with extras. Just to contextualise that, the NHS in this country costs £100 billion a year to run. Okay? So it's a small budget that the UN has, and it does rely on voluntary contributions, but 3% goes to the most effective part of the system. Thank you.
Yeah. We can just start.
That sense of controversy.
Rosa will be passing her hat later to take contributions. It's
not a bad idea, actually. Yeah. All right, we're going to switch gears a little bit. I was asked to come on here and talk about, I think it was crisis management, disaster management. Then there was this little controversial tweet going out promoting this event where someone mentioned the term natural disaster. And this is, in anyone engaging with sort of contemporary discussion on disaster studies, it's becoming an increasingly controversial term. And in order to save face in front of all my colleagues and at least one of my PhD students, I had to go on Twitter and say, okay, I promise I'm going to talk about how disasters are not natural. And so that's partly what I'm going to be doing today. But also this is because I am coming from a slightly different perspective than that of my colleagues, in that I am mainly interested in the UN in terms of the role it has in the wider global governance system. So I'm really interested in the development of international law, in the development of international law and policy, and in the interpretation of various actors involved in this development and interpretation of international law. And I have since become very interested, coming originally from interpreting the Charter, which is a beautiful, amazing document. It is, it really is. I second that. We're not going to be talking much about it today. Moving beyond that, to think more about how it operates in new spheres that were not necessarily thought of around the time of the establishment of the United Nations. So when we think about disasters and the UN role in disaster and disaster management, we're thinking about, I don't know, well, you can see these pictures, but we're thinking about these kind of pictures with action from the UN coming in helping. We might see, for example, the World Food Programme coming in, helping delivering food on the ground. We have some pictures out front if you want to have a look. We're also thinking about the UN OCHA, obviously Humanitarian Affairs, which plays a very important coordinating role. You will see, for example, ads from UNICEF asking you to donate so that they can then distribute this money to people in need in the aftermath of the disaster. What has happened is that we have increasingly realized that just responding to disasters is not enough. So we need to start working on the prevention of disasters long before the disaster actually strikes, because by then it's already too late. And in order to get to this point, we have to get to this point first. What is a disaster? There is no universally agreed definition of what a disaster is. But one thing we can agree upon, we don't agree upon a lot, is that there needs to be some kind of hazard met with meeting some kind of vulnerability. And that has to lead to some certain adverse effects of a certain magnitude. I have put a picture here of the Lisbon Earthquake back in 1755. This is a devastating disaster in Europe. In response to this earthquake, Rousseau was the first person to point out what is now known as disaster prevention, when he stated that indeed what actually created this devastation and this disaster was not just the earthquake of the forces of nature, it was the fact that we had built the city in a certain way, in a place which is prone to earthquake and tsunamis, and that thereby created a vulnerability for ourselves in this space. And that's important, and that's something we continue to work on still today. So the good news then, with disasters not being natural, I want to stress this, I can say this over and over again, they're not natural. Problematic is that the UN, while trying to regulate disasters, is still using the term quite often, natural disasters. Everyone is still forgiven if you use it, that's fine. But it's something we're trying to change. Because the good news about them not being natural is that we can regulate them. We can look at these vulnerabilities and see where these vulnerabilities are coming from. And they're coming from a multitude of different places, including poverty. We see that poor people often live in less secure areas. You will see the way houses are built, for example. You will also see what people living, for example, in unofficial floodplains are prone to flooding. They're also coming from vulnerability of us wanting to build cities and uncontrolled development in high-risk areas. So we're seeing buildings being built in places perhaps where they shouldn't be, but also we're seeing the development of, for example, water dams in an unsafe manner that when met with a surprising amount of rain will cause devastating floodings, and we've seen this this year in Asia amongst other places. So a question then, what is the UN going to do about all this? There's been a few different, I'm not going to go through all the whole legal system of the UN to regulate disasters, but I wanted to point out a few things. It took a very, very long time for the UN to listen to Rousseau, unsurprisingly perhaps. But towards the end of the 1980s, the UN General Assembly came together and stated that the 1990s should be the International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction. And so begun a range of processes that started to develop international policy on disaster risk reduction. How can we prevent disasters? And we saw a number of different documents and resolutions and strategies being adopted along the way. Fast forward a little bit, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction was adopted in 2015, so only 3 years ago. Some of you may know that this was the same year as the Paris Agreement on climate change was adopted as the Sustainable Development Goals. And these three are were supposed to be part of a coherent whole, and they do speak to each other to some degree. We can come back to the ways in which they could speak to each other more. But also, from a different angle, was the International Law Commission, who adopted draft articles on the protection of persons in the event of disasters in 2016. And the International Law Commission, if you remember this picture that Sarah had about the UN, the International Law Commission sits under the General Assembly and has the task of codifying and progressively developing international law. It's an exceptionally important body for international lawyers in general, but for the development of international law. So they have then come together. They had Eduardo Valencia Espina was the special rapporteur. He spent nearly a decade trying to figure out how states are actually responding to disasters, what different agreements do we have out there, what different policies do we have out there, what are states actually doing about this, what do states and relevant organizations think that they should be doing about this. Putting this forward to the International Law Commission, who eventually adopted these draft articles on second reading. It is a kind of a top-down approach, if you think about it. It's quite a significant body in the UN system, but at the same time he consulted a number of various actors. So if you're coming back to what Rosa mentioned in terms of transparency, you can go in and see all his reports where he states also who he's been speaking to, what they have been arguing, and how they have responded to certain proposals. So it's a quite interesting process for anyone interested in this. And then you can also then look at, again, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement, importantly the human rights system. We are definitely, if you count disaster lawyers, if we are a thing, we are definitely trying to get to human rights as much as we can, because despite all its problems, this is one of the places where we can look at saying, you know what, there are certain obligations under human rights law to prevent disasters from happening, or to prevent people, for example, specifically dying from disasters. But also the enforcement of implementation or protection of human rights can also reduce vulnerability. So we are really tapping into the disaster human rights sphere quite a lot. Some more than others, but I'm definitely guilty of that, and I'm not ashamed. So just to mention the Sendai framework, because I think it's a fascinating document in terms of what the UN is doing and that no one really knows about. Very few. How many people in here will know about the Sendai framework? Okay, anyone who's not my student, it was probably one or two. Okay, excellent. And Rosa, fantastic. If you compare this to, for example, the UN General Assembly or the Security Council, this is happening and taking place within a process which is far more anonymous or almost invisible. If you remember the picture, I think was the UNISDR, the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. That was like, you had the UN General Assembly here, and then all the UN agencies. And this very corner here on Sari's picture, that's where you would find the UNISDR. So it's quite a small sort of cornered part of the UN system. But I think it's important to highlight that these organizations or institutions also exist. And they have been working, UNISDR have been working to facilitate this development of what is now the Sendai framework. They started with consultations initiated in March 2012 with stakeholders, going beyond just states and other UN organs, but also engaging with civil society and various networks in order to listen to as many voices as possible. Of course, not a perfect process by any means, but still, it's an ongoing process. They then had the Hyogo Framework for Action, which was a predecessor to Sendai. And so they had something to work with. They looked at the implementations of that, and they looked at the remaining problems of that. And then they invited a very broad range of actors to come along and to have their say. And they did this under the task. They were tasked by the UN General Assembly to do this. So they have authority from the UN General Assembly. Again, one state, one vote. All the states have said that the UNISDR is the agency to take this forward. And then the UNISDR then has decided, with this authority, to say this is how we're going to be doing this. And what they are doing and continuing to do, is that they coordinate and facilitate the development of international law and policy in this area. And they facilitate it on a regional basis, they facilitate it on a global basis. So every 2 years they have a global platform. And of course the way in which they do this and who they invite into these processes will determine essentially who is part of shaping, in this instance, shaping international law and policy moving forward. And I think that's important to think of. This is not a powerful organ of the United Nations whatsoever. It's a very sort of, not to say sideline, but a very small part. If the UN human rights system has 3%, I don't even want to go into the percentage of the UNISDR. But I think that's really important to keep in mind, that there are ways in which the UN works that is not necessarily with extreme power, but they facilitate discussion and facilitate, and thereby also perhaps create or reinstate the already existing powers amongst other actors as well. We're running a bit out of time, so I just wanted to mention the 4 priorities, what Sendai framework and what the states have agreed to work towards. It's about understand what disaster risk is. It's about strengthening disaster risk governance to manage disaster risk, including having laws and policies in place. Investing for resilience. Some fantastic word, isn't it? So resilience is one of those fantastic words that no one really knows what it means. In this context, it means that states should reduce their vulnerability, essentially, to disasters and be able to more prevent disasters from happening and bounce back when they happen. And enhance disaster preparedness and to build back better in recovery and rehabilitation after a disaster has happened. So the idea is that once a disaster has happened, we should support each other, states that is, and actors, to build back better and safer, so that next time that earthquake hits, it's not going to create so many losses. Key challenges with this. As always, implementation and enforcement is an issue. Political will is an issue, and we've heard this I think today, whatever it's about, we have issues within the UN system, and this is absolutely no exception. We need to bust the myth of the natural disasters in order to stress the importance of how they can be prevented and how disaster losses can be prevented. Because if states can link back to the idea that, this is natural forces, this is not our fault, this is an act of God defense, that's what we call that. As long as they can do that, it's going to be very hard to incentivize action. We need to work to break the silos between different systems. So Rosa was talking about the different pillars of the UN. They have 3 different pillars. Of course, we saw the multitude of institutions and organizations. They all have their own little silos where they're working. Their own priorities, their own traditions, perhaps to some extent their own funding. And we need to think about how they can work together to actually ensure that these objectives are met and that they can come together. And that's not just on the UN level, but also goes into governmental levels, because there are different government agencies working on this. So you have different government agencies working on development and disaster risk reduction and climate change and human rights. And instead of working together, they tend to sometimes get into, not necessarily working against each other, but they're working in isolation in ways that can be very unproductive. And we need to make sure that this happens in an inclusive manner, to make sure that this is not being abused in a way, for example, Build Back Better is not being abused to just be luxury hotels where there used to be a fisherman village after a tsunami has struck, for example. And we have seen examples of this happening, especially after the 2004 international tsunami. So we need, therefore, to make sure that this is happening with respect to human rights and within the broader context of thinking about development and the challenges of climate change. And I will stop there. Any questions? I rushed through that.
All right, so let's open it up to questions and discussion, comments, disagreements on any of the topics that we had. Well, I have some. So I have some. Oh, somebody has one. Okay, good.
Kind of general thing. Do you think the kind of creaking of the liberal world order will have a big impact on the UN Or do you think it's sort of sufficiently entrenched and there are other states ready to kind of take up the sort of challenges?
The UN, like any other organization, can only reflect the underlying political order. It doesn't, it is part of it. So inevitably, growing populism and in particular the growing disenchantment, imagined by some of the powerful states that sustain the activities of the UN, is inevitably going to have a huge impact on the organization, both politically but also administratively in terms of its operations. So we normally, the UN very much reflects the interests and values of the US in 1945. Arguably, it still largely reflects the interests of the US in 2016. But there is and that's certainly the interpretation that many other states would have of when they look at the actions that in particular the Council has taken over the last decade or two. But that notwithstanding, there's a clear perception in the current US government, the Trump administration, that the UN is wildly out of line with US interests. And if a hegemonic state is disenchanted with the organization that is actually upholding its own interests, that organization is clearly in deep trouble in some form. And now how does it manifest itself? It manifests itself by either the increasing illegitimacy of its decisions at the political level and increasing divisions at the political level, and we see those, and we see growing deadlock within the Council that, while by no means as extreme and institutionalized as during the Cold War, it's clearly much, much more pronounced than it would have been 10 years ago. But you also start to see it at the operational level, when the US starts to say, well, we want to dramatically slash the budget, or we need in particular, we are no longer running for the Human Rights Council, or we're not funding UNESCO anymore, or we are no longer funding particular UN operations like the UNRWA in the Palestinian territory. So that has direct operational consequences for it, because either if the major paymaster for the organization no longer provides funding in certain areas, either the funding disappears and therefore the activity disappears, or other states step up who attach their own conditions to their particular funding. So if other states are stepping in to support, for example, UNRWA in the Palestinian territories, and they come largely from the Gulf, then it's going to shape the nature of their particular operation. It's going to change the education that it provides. It is going to change the way it provides health services and other things, because these states financing it will attach their own conditions either formally or informally to that. So it will start to change the character of the organization.
I'd like to just add something a little more hopeful to that. I mean, I completely agree with that, but I think also we saw during the Cold War, it's something we didn't talk about very much here, but the United Nations during the Cold War, especially the Security Council, pretty much couldn't do anything because the US and Soviet Union just vetoed one another kind of back and forth. So it was a very kind of low action organization during that time in some respects. But it did survive. It did come out the other end, and then there was a big heyday in the 90s when it was, we're free, we can do things, and it did become very much more active. So what's interesting to think about is kind of the cycles of life that an organization like this goes through. And if we compare it to its predecessor, the League of Nations, which lived a very short life and very unsuccessful one in some respects, the UN seems to have, to use your word, a little bit of resilience. I mean, people sort of popularly like to say, well, if we didn't have the UN, we would invent it. And there may be some truth to that. I think we will definitely see it in a changed form. Its effectiveness will go down even more, particularly relating to the budget questions that we just heard about. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the UN will die as an organization, that it will dissipate.
I mean, I think if you were to start this today, you would never get to the United Nations. 193 countries sitting around a table, agreeing on any kind of institution. It happened at a particular moment, and I think a lot of the times when reform proposals are opened up, one of the fears is, hold on a minute, are we going to lose a lot of the very good work and good essence of the UN? I think if you're a social scientist to my right, you take this realist perspective. If you're a lawyer like me, you take an idealist perspective, which is, it's all going to be okay, right? Trump's in for 2 more years, maximum 6. The EU and Japan are giving the budgets at the moment for the Population Fund, which deals with reproductive health, or for UNRWA, and we'll muddle along through. If we got through the Cold War, if we've got through a couple of genocides in the 90s, you know, is Trump really going to topple this? And I think he will. I don't think he will, and I don't think that, you know, particularly after the elections last night, that the House of Representatives is going to allow him to either.